even if there were no trade unions, even if there was no industrial action, we would still have 120,000 plus vacancies in the NHS, and we would still have really difficult issues of recruitment, retention and motivation.
Nurses in England are taking part in a fresh strike in what they describe as their biggest walkout so far. These are nurses who are members of the Royal College of Nursing, and it affects half of England's NHS trusts. It's going to last until midnight tonight. A little bit early on in the programme, we heard from one NHS Trust chief executive who said that one of their ITU departments was in effect closed last night after nurses refused a request to come back to work, that despite there being some agreement in place prior to that. How widespread is this kind of problem, and how damaging is this strike going to be, and how far off is some kind of agreement? Matthew Taylor is Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation. They represent NHS trusts, so has quite a wide perspective on all of this. Morning, Matthew.
Good morning.
First of all, what do you make of that situation, which, as I just described there, we heard from a chief executive earlier on today, the fact that even though there are these agreements in place, which means that for some intensive care units and the rest, they can request striking workers to come back in when staffing is so low it's unsafe, they can refuse that.
Yeah, so that sounds like a really unfortunate circumstance. I mean, across the country, the number of those mitigations, as they're called, that have been agreed by the RCN has been rising. And so it's good that generally agreement is able to be reached between local managers and the RCN to maintain life and limb cover them. I mean, actually, the point I just want to emphasize here is that, it's often the case that politicians, when they're being a bit lazy, criticize NHS managers, but it's NHS managers who've had to work round the clock to try to manage these very difficult situations, to put contingencies in place, to negotiate those mitigations if they're required. So it's going to be a tough day today. Fortunately, it's only one day, not two, and then attention, of course, will turn to the Staff Council tomorrow and its decision about whether or not to accept the deal that's on the table.
And how much hope are you putting in that meeting tomorrow? Because this will in effect decide whether the deal that the government has put on the table, a 5% pay rise for this year and a sort of cash payment of at least £1,600 for last year, that will decide whether that is just sort of unilaterally given to everybody. Do you think that could put an end to some strikes, or actually, nurses and some other NHS workers still could strike beyond that? But do you think it will change the dynamic?
Well, it's up to the trade unions. It looks as though a majority of staff who did vote for this package, and whilst I understand that it only goes a short way to closing the gap that's built up between NHS pay and in terms of how much they've lost in real terms, our colleagues have lost in real terms, it is progress. And it's a success of the trade unions, because let's not forget that for several months, the government refused even to enter into negotiations, refused to countenance the possibility of topping up what was agreed for last year. So it is progress. And we hope that the unions, firstly, will act together. The structure of pay in the NHS is called Agenda for Change. It provides good career progression. It means that we are able to negotiate as one body. It would be much, much more difficult if we had to have lots of different negotiations. So we hope the unions will stay together, and we hope that they will accept this deal.
But even if they do accept it, strikes could still continue over the settlement for this year and last. And if we're already at the point where even intensive care and cancer nurses are striking in this round of strikes in England, we could even go beyond that.
Well, I'd hope very much that if there is a majority on the Staff Council for accepting the deal, that all the unions accept that. As I say, the unions operating together is what enabled staff to win important concessions in this package, and it's what will enable them to have strength in the future. So we hope the unions will act together. There's the outstanding issue, of course, is the junior doctors' strike, and there we don't even have really the basis for negotiation. We called several weeks ago for ACAS, the conciliation service, to be brought in, and the BMA have agreed to that, but the government, unfortunately, so far has not. Yes, we desperately need to see the end of this industrial action. It's been going on for 6 months. Each time it occurs, there are issues for patient safety, patient dignity, an enormous amount of work that managers I represent have to do when they'd much rather be, of course, addressing the demand of patients for care and also that backlog that has built up over several years. So look, we're not out of the woods, but it would be really important progress if we got agreement on accepting the deal tomorrow.
Yeah, but on the next issue to resolve, as you mentioned, what's happening with the junior doctors. How do you realistically see this playing out? Is it the case that we just have to go through the motions as we have with other parts of the NHS, where we have protracted periods of strikes? Eventually, the government comes to the table and then they agree on something like 5% and a cash payment. I mean, do you see that happening again with the junior doctors over a similar time frame?
Yeah, well, I think you're right in the sense that what's rather perplexing about the junior doctors dispute is that there is no negotiation, and presumably both sides recognise that in the end this is going to have to end up in talks. It's not what one hopes going to be an interminable strike. So you have to find the basis for that, and that's why we've called for ACAS to be involved. But there's still a very big gap between the government and the trade unions. The other big issue, just to say, is that even if there were no trade unions, even if there was no industrial action, we would still have 120,000 plus vacancies in the NHS, and we would still have really difficult issues of recruitment, retention, and motivation. I talk to leaders all the time. They say they're more worried about morale, they're more worried about retention of staff than they've ever been before. So the other thing we'll be looking out for is that after the local elections, we hope we'll finally see something we've been promised for years and was promised in last autumn's autumn statement, which is a workforce plan, a proper long-term costed workforce plan for the NHS, because that's what we really need to address. It's not just about pay, it's also about working conditions and the number of NHS staff who work in teams that are understaffed.